The ground shook before I even saw them, 3 heavy footsteps hitting the dirt in perfect rhythm, and I turned around holding a moving crate to find 3 towering orc women blocking the path to my new front door, arms crossed, tusks catching the light of 2 setting suns, and every instinct in my body screamed that I was about to become fertilizer for my own wheat field. I dropped the crate. It shattered. Nobody moved to stop me from panicking, which somehow made it worse. "You are the new landholder," the one in the middle said. Her voice sounded like gravel being poured slowly into a metal drum. She was easily 8 feet tall, shoulders like a door frame, skin the color of moss under storm clouds. I opened my mouth to answer and nothing came out. My hand found the deed papers still folded in my jacket pocket, the ones I had signed 3 days earlier back on a cramped shuttle station, when a colonial land grant on a planet called Threshka Prime had sounded like the fresh start I desperately needed. "There's nothing about tenants in this contract," I finally managed, my voice cracking halfway through the sentence. The tallest one, standing to the left, tilted her head. 60-second clause, standard on every Threshcan farm deed. Existing labor arrangements transfer with the land. I fumbled the papers open right there in the dirt, wind snapping the pages against my fingers, and found it. Buried in font so small I needed to hold it an inch from my face. Existing tenant laborers, if any, retain residency and employment per prior agreement. I got scammed by font size, I whispered. The third one, a hand shorter than the other 2 but still built like she could arm wrestle a tractor, let out a laugh that sounded like a landslide finding something funny. "Human, you did not get scammed. You got 3 of the best hands on this continent for the price of a filing fee. Now are you going to stand there shaking, or come inside so we can go over the harvest schedule before the frost hits?" That was the exact moment I understood 2 things about my new life. The first was that I was very possibly about to die on my own front porch. The second, arriving a few seconds later once nobody had actually eaten me, was that the fence around the east field looked like it hadn't been repaired since before I was born, and that thought bothered me more than 3 armed orc women standing in my yard. I still don't know what that says about me. Maybe nothing good. Their names were Grosk, the one in the middle who spoke first, Vanda, the tallest, and Itiri, the one who laughed like falling rock. Over the following days I learned they had worked this land for 11 years under the previous owner, a quiet farmer named Aldrich who had passed away with no children to inherit the deed, which was exactly how the property ended up back on the open market with nobody bothering to read past the water rights clause. He was decent, Grosk told me on my second morning, watching me struggle to fit a harness onto something called a plow beast, a 6-legged creature roughly the size of a delivery truck and about as willing to cooperate as a brick wall. For a human, didn't flinch around us. Worked the fields himself instead of hiring us and hiding inside all day. "Is that unusual?" I asked, still fighting the harness buckle. "Most humans pay for orc labor and never step outside again," Vanda said without looking up from the grain scale she was balancing with terrifying precision. "Scared, I think. Or they believe getting their hands dirty next to us is beneath them." I did not mention that 90 seconds ago I genuinely believed I might not survive the introduction. Something told me bringing that up would not help my case. Instead I said, "Well, I don't know the first thing about running a Threshcan farm, so I suppose I'll be working next to you whether either of us likes it or not." Itiri, replacing fence posts along the eastern line like they weighed nothing more than kindling, snorted with approval. "That's the first smart thing you've said, little landholder." Little Landholder became my name on that farm for a long while after that, and honestly, I earned it. The suns here were merciless, twin discs that turned my shoulders raw and blistered within 2 weeks. Grosk, Vanda, and Itiri could each lift equipment that would have needed a mechanical winch back home. They worked 16-hour days without a single complaint, hauling grain sacks that outweighed me, repairing stone walls with bare hands, and somehow still had energy left at dusk to argue cheerfully about whose turn it was to cook. By any physical measure, I was the weakest presence on that farm, and the land made sure I never forgot it. But I started noticing things they had never needed to notice. I redesigned the irrigation trenches using slope calculations that apparently nobody on this continent had ever bothered with, because orc farming tradition favored raw strength over careful measurement, digging canals wide and deep rather than angled and efficient. Within a season, water reached the far fields 3 days faster and wasted almost nothing along the way. I also solved the mystery of what everyone called the cursed Northfield, a stretch of soil that produced stunted, sickly crops no matter what anyone tried. It wasn't cursed. It was missing a mineral the coastal soil had in abundance. My grandfather used a nearly identical trick on his land back on Earth, grinding shells into powder and working them into depleted dirt. I hauled sacks of crushed shell up from the coast for 3 straight days, until my arms felt like wet rope, and by the following spring, the cursed field produced our best yield on the entire farm. Then there was the blight. Every third autumn, something ate through half our grain stores overnight, and everyone had simply accepted it as bad luck, a cruel rhythm of the land nobody could explain. I stayed up past midnight for a week straight, reading through old farming records by lantern light, cross-referencing insect life cycles until I found it. A native beetle with exactly a 3-year larval stage, dormant in the soil until it emerged all at once to devour everything in reach. The fix wasn't complicated once you knew the cause. A single rotation crop planted every 3rd year starved the larvae out before they could hatch. None of it felt heroic while I was doing it. It felt like paperwork, sore hands, and stubbornness that refused to quit even when my body begged me to stop. But by the end of that first full season, our total yield had climbed by nearly half, and Grosk, who did not hand out compliments as a matter of personal policy, looked over the packed grain stores, went completely silent for a long moment, and finally said, "Huh." I later learned that from Grosk. That single sound carried the weight of a full speech of praise. Vonda actually told me so with a completely straight face, and I chose to believe her. Life on the farm settled into something I hadn't expected to find out here, something almost peaceful. Mornings began before the second sun cleared the hills, with Itiri already out checking fence lines and humming some tune from a homeland I never quite got the full story of. Grosk ran the numbers on grain storage with the precision of an accountant who also happened to be able to lift a full-grown plow beast off its feet if it got stuck in the mud. Vonda handled the animals, and there was something strangely gentle about watching someone that powerful speak softly to a nervous, skittish creature until it calmed down and followed her anywhere. Evenings were my favorite part, if I'm being honest. We'd sit outside as the twin suns dipped below the hills, sharing whatever stew Itiri had thrown together, and they'd tell me stories about Threshka Prime that no guidebook back on the shuttle station had bothered to mention. Stories about how orc communities out here had been farming this land for generations before any human colony ship ever landed, how the soil had its own moods, its own history, its own patience that outlasted every owner who thought they could rush it. I told them about Earth in return, about grain silos and thunderstorms, and a grandfather who taught me more about dirt than any classroom ever did. Vonda found it endlessly funny that humans built entire machines just to avoid touching soil directly. Grosk mostly listened without comment, though I noticed she remembered every detail, bringing pieces of it up weeks later in ways that told me she'd actually been paying attention the whole time. It wasn't easy, not always. There were arguments over methods, moments where my careful measurements clashed with their generations of instinct, and more than once I lost those arguments because their instincts turned out to be right. But there was respect underneath all of it, growing quietly the way good crops do, without anyone announcing it out loud. The trouble came in the second autumn, on a morning that started like every other. Cool air, low mist over the fields, Itiri already humming somewhere near the fence line. I was checking the grain store inventory, when I heard the sound that stopped every single one of us cold. Hooves, many of them, moving fast and coming from the eastern ridge where no traveler had any real reason to be. Vonda was the first to react, dropping the feed bucket she was carrying and moving toward the equipment shed with a calm speed that told me this wasn't the first time she'd heard that sound. "Raiders," she said, not shouting, just stating a fact, the way you'd mention the weather. Kravoth crew, probably splinters from the group that hit the Dunmore settlement last spring. They target isolated farms because the militia post is 3 days' ride from here. My stomach dropped somewhere near my boots. "How many?" "Enough," Grosk said, already moving toward the house. "Little landholder, get inside and get the flare gun." I didn't argue. I ran. Here's what I need you to understand about that morning, about the exact shape of the fear that gripped me as I sprinted for the house. It wasn't just fear for myself. It was fear for the 2 women I could see through the window. One calmly stringing a bow like she was preparing for target practice instead of a fight, the other rolling her shoulders and cracking her knuckles with an expression that was somehow both furious and completely composed. I found the flare gun exactly where I'd stored it months earlier, tucked into a drawer beside a stack of tools I'd brought from the shuttle station out of pure habit. Growing up in tornado country teaches you one lesson early, and it sticks with you forever. You always have a warning system. Because waiting until trouble arrives to start planning for it is how people get hurt. I burst back outside just as the first riders crested the ridge, 6 of them, dust rising behind their mounts, weapons catching the early light. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flare gun twice before I managed to aim it skyward and fire. The flare shot upward with a hiss and burst into a bright red bloom against the pale morning sky, visible for miles in every direction, a signal that would reach the militia post faster than any messenger could ride. "Good," Grosk said, not even glancing at me, her eyes locked on the approaching riders. "Now get behind the grain store and stay low." I did not get behind the grain store. I want to say I stayed because I was brave, but the honest truth is my legs simply refused to move, rooted to the spot as the riders closed the distance, shouting something I couldn't make out over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Vonda moved first, and it happened faster than I could track. She drew, aimed, and released in one smooth motion, and the lead rider's advance broke apart into confusion as his mount reared unexpectedly, throwing his charge completely off balance. He wasn't seriously hurt, just knocked from his saddle hard enough to reconsider his life choices, but the message landed clearly. This farm was not the easy target they'd been told to expect. Itiri didn't wait for a second shot. She moved toward the plowbeast pen, threw open the gate, and with a sharp command sent the enormous creature lumbering directly into the path between the riders and the grain store. Watching a six-legged beast the size of a delivery truck plant itself as a living wall is something I will never forget as long as I live, and it worked exactly as she intended. Two of the riders' mounts refused to go near it, wheeling away in a panic that spread quickly through the rest of the group. Grosk walked forward, completely unarmed, hands loose at her sides, and began speaking in a voice that carried across the whole yard without her ever raising it. I couldn't hear every word from where I was frozen, but I caught enough to understand she was reminding them, calmly and at considerable length, that this farm had buried worse men than them out in the North Field, and that anyone who wanted to test that story was welcome to try their luck. It wasn't true. Nothing was buried in that field except crushed shell and 3 years of careful crop rotation. But she said it with such total, unshakable conviction that two of the riders actually turned their mounts around on the spot without waiting to see how the rest of the confrontation ended. The remaining 4 hesitated, caught between orders from whoever had sent them and the sudden realization that this farm had teeth they hadn't been warned about. That hesitation was exactly the window we needed. I don't know how long it actually took for the militia to arrive after I fired that flare. It felt like hours crammed into minutes, every second stretched thin by adrenaline. But the truth was closer to 20 minutes, faster than any of the raiders had planned for, because a signal flare travels a lot quicker than word of mouth, and the moment the militia riders appeared cresting the same ridge the raiders had come from, the remaining 4 turned and scattered without a single blow being exchanged. Just like that, it was over. No one was seriously hurt. The plowbeast trotted back to its pen looking mildly annoyed at having its morning interrupted. Vonda calmly retrieved her arrow from where it had struck the ground. Grosk exhaled slowly and rolled her shoulders like she'd just finished a long but ordinary chore. I sat down hard right there in the dirt, my legs finally giving out now that there was nothing left to run from, and I stayed there shaking for a good while before Itiri walked over and lowered herself onto the ground beside me, the boards of the nearby porch creaking under the sudden shift in weight, even though we weren't sitting on them. She handed me a mug of something warm that tasted like fermented regret, and I drank it anyway because my hands needed something to hold on to. "You didn't run," she said, watching the militia riders speak with Grosk near the fence line. "I didn't have anywhere to run to," I said, my voice still unsteady. "This is my farm." She considered that for a long moment, turning her own mug slowly between fingers thick enough to crush stone. Aldrich used to say humans were the strangest thing the colonies ever produced. Too soft to win most fights outright, and far too stubborn to accept losing one. "That sounds about right," I admitted. "It does," she agreed. And for the first time since the day I'd arrived, she smiled at me the way you smile at someone who belongs somewhere, not someone you're simply tolerating out of contractual obligation. "Welcome to the farm, little landholder." I raised my mug toward her, and across the yard, Grosk and Vonda, already dragging a fallen fence post between them as if the morning's danger had never happened, raised theirs in return without missing a step in their work. Later that evening, once the militia had ridden off with assurances that patrols would increase near our stretch of the eastern ridge, the 4 of us sat outside as the twin suns finally dipped below the hills, and nobody mentioned the raid again. Itiri made a joke about my flare gun aim being terrible even though it had worked perfectly, and Vonda spent a solid 10 minutes explaining, in far more technical detail than necessary, exactly how she'd calculated the angle to spook the lead rider's mount, without actually harming him. Grosk mostly just watched the field settle into darkness, occasionally adding a quiet word here or there, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her look since the day we met. I thought back to that first afternoon, standing frozen in the yard with a shattered crate at my feet, absolutely certain I'd made the worst decision of my life signing that deed. I thought about the 60-second clause buried in 6-point font, the one piece of fine print that had changed everything without me ever choosing it on purpose. Nobody had mentioned 3 towering orc women anywhere in that contract, There was no line item for Grosk's steady calm under pressure, no clause explaining Vonda's precision with a bow or her surprising gentleness with frightened animals, nothing about Etiri's laugh that could shake dust from the rafters, or her instinct for exactly the right moment to release the plow beast. I finished my drink, looked out over fields that finally, after 2 full seasons of stubborn work, belonged to something real, something that had teeth when it needed them, and warmth when it didn't, and decided that whatever lawyer had buried that clause in tiny font had accidentally done me the greatest favor of my life. The suns disappeared fully behind the hills. Somewhere out near the fence line, the plow beast let out a low, satisfied groan, settling in for the night. Grosk stood, stretched until her joints cracked audibly, and told everyone it was time to turn in, because dawn on this farm never waited for anyone, human or otherwise. I got up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and followed the 3 of them inside, already thinking about tomorrow's work, already feeling, for the first time since I'd left Earth, like exactly where I was supposed to be.